Erase his name. That's all my son said. 3 words that sliced through 40 years of fatherhood like glass through skin. The lawyer didn't even look up. His pen hovered above the will, waiting. Matthew stood there, suit sharp, voice flat, as if he were deleting a typo, not erasing his own father from his life. Outside, rain tapped against the window, soft and cruel. I could hear my heartbeat echoing in the silence. Every drop of ink that touched the paper felt like a shovel of dirt over my name, burying me alive beneath signatures and shame. It's not personal, he murmured. It's just business. Business. The word that once meant survival for me, now used to execute my memory. My throat tightened. I wanted to remind him of the nights I carried him on my shoulders through storm water, the times I skipped dinner so he could eat, but the words wouldn't come. Only one thought burned through the fog. My blood now wants to erase me, and the lawyer's pen kept moving. Stay here, because what happened after that meeting wasn't just betrayal. It was a storm that turned a quiet man into a force of reckoning. What unfolded next will make you question everything you thought you knew about loyalty, inheritance, and the price of being a father. Follow along. The next part cuts even deeper. I was 30 when the factory siren first felt like a heartbeat. The old mill sat at the edge of town, ribs of rust and steam, a place where men learned to be quiet and metal learned to obey. I signed on for the night shift in the summer of 1991, the same week we brought Matthew home from the hospital. He weighed 7 pounds, 3 ounces, his fingers curled around mine like they had been waiting there forever. The nurse said, "He's got a strong grip." I laughed. "He takes after his mother." Back then, our life was simple. We rented the second floor of a leaning blue house that made the wind whistle in the winter. The kitchen had chipped tile and a window with white paint that always stuck on humid days. We ate late, we slept light, and we counted dollars the way other people counted stars. Still, every morning felt like a kind of victory. Coffee in a chipped mug, a baby gurgling in the bassinet, my wife humming a gospel tune that never had all the words. She'd nudge me and say, "Philip, promise me one thing. Promise me the boy will never grow up feeling small." "I promise," I'd say. "I'll build him a world where that's impossible." I believed it. A man's belief is a dangerous thing. It can make him stay too long, work too hard, stretch himself thinner than the truth. When Matthew was 3, my wife's cough started. Just a flicker at first, like a chair leg catching on tile. By Christmas, it had a rhythm. By Valentine's Day, it had a name. She sat on the sofa, a blanket over her knees, light from the window laying soft across her hair. "We're going to be fine," she told me. I nodded because men learn to nod when love is terrified. We tried the pills we couldn't afford and the prayers we couldn't live without. She smiled through the worst nights and said, "Make him laugh, Philip. His laugh is medicine." On her last morning, the sky looked clean and hard as a blade. Matthew crawled onto the bed and pressed his ear to her chest. She lifted a hand, thin, light, shaking, and smoothed his hair. "Be good to your father," she whispered, though he was too young to know where to put those words. I kissed her knuckles and asked God for a miracle that didn't come. We buried her in March. The ground was still stubborn with frost. I went back to the factory the next night because grief is expensive. I packed Matthew's diaper bag, set him in the care of Mrs. Keene down the hall, and told him I'd be back before the moon changed its mind. He cried, fat tears slipping down, and I felt something rip and keep ripping. Those first years alone felt like living on a wire. I worked nights, I napped in pieces. I learned how to fix a fever with lukewarm baths and how to hide the tremble in my hands by keeping them busy. Every payday had a map: rent, groceries, the envelope labeled Matthew, where I tucked $10 no matter what. I told myself each bill I paid was another brick in the promise I'd made his mother. He grew like an apology I didn't know I needed. Fast, hungry, curious. At 6, he was always asking, "What's that?" He'd point to my lunch pail, the drill, the oil in the garage that made rainbows on the floor. I told him everything I knew. "This is a crescent wrench. This is a socket. This is the sound of a bolt loosening. It means someone cared enough to tighten it first." On his 8th birthday, I took him to the diner where the waitress called everyone honey, and the pancakes were the size of sorrow. I'd saved $40. It felt like treasure. Matthew squeezed the syrup bottle until it made a high squeal and laughed so loud people turned. I didn't care. I wanted the whole town to see him happy. Make a wish, I told him. He closed his eyes and said, I wish. I wish the house would stop whistling at night. I laughed. Done. That weekend I patched the window frame with putty I borrowed from the neighbor. The wind kept whistling, but softer, like it knew it had lost. The day the school sent home a note saying Matthew was gifted in mathematics, I read it 3 times. It felt like being handed a new name. I taped it to the fridge with blue painter's tape, as if the wall could be a trophy case. You're smart, I told him, not because a paper says so, because you pay attention. He shrugged and said, Can we get pizza? I said yes and meant it the way a man means survival. High school sharpened him. He discovered numbers like some boys discover engines, by ear, by instinct, by stubbornness. I quit the night shift and traded it for swing to see him more, but that meant less pay. I started taking weekend maintenance jobs. I crawled through crawl spaces heavy with dust. I fixed boilers that hissed like snakes. Every time I wanted to quit, I pictured him bent over a textbook, chewing his pencil, forehead wrinkled in the precise way his mother used to frown at bills. Senior year, he brought home a glossy packet, a private college 2 states away, the kind that puts its name on its sweatshirts like a crown. Full tuition? No. A partial scholarship. The rest was a cliff. He sat at the kitchen table, fingers laced, eyes bright. I can do this, he said. I can be someone. I looked at the numbers. I felt the old wire sway. You already are someone, I said. He stared at me like I had missed the point. Maybe I had. Maybe he had. That night I drove to the mill supervisor's house and asked for more hours. The supervisor said, We're cutting shifts, not adding them. I nodded and knocked on other doors. Someone needed a fence fixed. Someone needed a roof patched. Someone needed cash paid in awkward gratitude. I took it all. I put away $40, then $60, then $100. I sold my wife's record collection, the one I swore I'd keep forever, and lied to myself that she'd understand. I sold my father's watch. I learned how to live with less and smile like I didn't mind. Before he left for college, we stood in the doorway like soldiers. I pressed a small envelope into his hand, $1,240 in tens and twenties, wrapped in the rubber band I used to keep bolts together. Emergency money, I said. He looked at it and looked at me. For a second, the child rose to the surface and said through the man, Thanks, Dad. Then he was gone, a shadow sliding into a future I could not follow. The first semester he called every Sunday. He told me about professors with hair like thunderstorms, about a roommate who snored like a broken radiator, about a calculus proof that made him feel like he'd been handed the keys to a new language. His voice, bright, quick, was a medicine I rationed until the next Sunday. When he came home for Thanksgiving, he wore a coat that fit like confidence and carried himself as if the earth had tilted in his favor. You look taller, I said. He laughed. Maybe you're just shorter. It was a joke. I laughed because that's what you do when someone you love draws a line and pretends it's a river. By junior year, the calls got shorter. He was busy. Just checking in, he'd say. Everything good? I'd say yes, even when the water heater coughed a brown apology into the tub or the transmission on the Ford stuttered like a nervous apology. I stopped telling him the small disasters. I wanted his head full of numbers, not the price of pipes. He came home less often. When he did, he looked around our kitchen as if it were a museum of things we couldn't afford to replace. After graduation, he got a job at a firm with glass walls where even the potted plants looked expensive and bored. I wore my best shirt to see him on his first day, the one with the collar that never quite lays flat. He smiled, hugged me quick, and introduced me to a colleague as Phil. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself men change and names learn to bend. On the drive home, I repeated the word Phil until it sounded like someone else. The first crack was subtle. He started sending money on birthdays instead of coming by. He started scheduling coffee like a meeting. We stood in line at a cafe once, him with a watch that could count his heartbeats and me with hands that still smelled faintly of oil, and he said, Dad, image matters. Clients want to know you're polished. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. I nodded, then washed my hands 3 times that night with lemon soap until the oil gave up. He brought Clara to Thanksgiving 2 years later. She was exactly beautiful in the way that gets advertised. Sharp dress, clean smile, voice like a well-lit room. She handed me a wine I couldn't pronounce and told me about a trip to Milan, the way some people tell you about a dentist appointment. Casual, necessary, painless. She asked what I did. When I told her I was still at the mill, she tilted her head, an angle I recognized from television when a character learned something mildly tragic. That's honorable, she said, which is what some people say when they mean small. Maybe it would have stayed manageable, his world growing wide, mine staying plain, if not for the real cut. The day the plant started talking about closing, the owner called us into the break room, a place where the coffee pot had been stubborn for a decade, and said words I will never forget because they didn't fit in his mouth. Global restructuring. Men who had names like Tools, Hank, Donnie, Earl, stared at the floor like it owed them something. I went home with a box of gloves and a coiled tape measure, and every bone in my back ached with the idea of starting over at 56. I didn't tell Matthew for a week. When I did, he said, "Dad, you should have told me sooner." I said, "You were busy." He said, "We're all busy." I heard it then, the first cold draft in the house of us. He offered help. I told him I had saved enough to last a while. I didn't say I had dipped into the envelope labeled Matthew more than once in the last 2 years. Pride is a poor man's inheritance. It buys dignity at a markup, but sometimes that's the only currency a man has. I found odd jobs again, the kind that leave you limping but grateful. I learned to live with the ache. On Sundays I still cooked for him. Sometimes he came, sometimes he didn't. When he missed 2 in a row, I called. Clara answered. "We're at a charity thing," she said. "It's for legacy planning." The phrase sounded like a chandelier. I looked up at my ceiling where a water stain had dried into the shape of a country we couldn't afford to visit. One night he did come by. He stood in our kitchen looking at the photos on the wall, the one where he's 5 and covered in cake, the one where he's 10 and missing a front tooth, the one where he's 17 and holding a medal for math like it was a ticket out. "Do you ever think about consolidating?" he asked. "Selling the house? Downsizing?" I stared at him, then at the window that still stuck in summer. "This house is where your mother sang," I said. "It's where you learned to write your name." He rubbed the back of his neck and said softly, "Names can change." That's when the crack became a line, became a fault. The firm promoted him. He bought a condo with a view of a river that someone else cleaned. He learned a vocabulary I couldn't speak: assets, instruments, optimization. He got sharper. He got kinder in public. He got busier in private. The last time we sat on the stoop together, he looked at his phone more than the sky. "Clients," he said. "They don't sleep." I nodded because I had spent half my life awake. Then came the meeting at the lawyer's office, the place where wood is polished enough to forget its tree. He told me it was a routine review for efficiency. He smiled too much. He held the door like a gentleman and spoke like a surgeon. I walked in thinking we were tidying paperwork. I sat down to discover we were tidying me. "Erase his name," he said. And the paper cut deeper than any blade I had ever known, not because it was sharp, but because I had sanded it smooth myself, year by year, shift by shift, promise by promise. I felt the past rise and press its hands against my ribs. The nurse saying, "Strong grip," my wife's whisper, the whistling window, the envelope of 10s and 20s bound like hope. You want to know when a heartbreak truly begins? It doesn't start with the order. It starts with the first time a child calls you by a smaller name. When we left the office, the sky had that same clean, hard look it wore the day we buried her. He stepped ahead, phone to his ear, voice easy. The wind caught my jacket and made it flap like an empty sail. I stood on the steps and thought of the promise I made a lifetime ago. He will never feel small. And that's when something in me decided to grow. For legal safety. Matthew said it with the steadiness of a surgeon prepping a cut. We were at his condo that looked like a magazine page. White leather sofa, a river view framed by glass so clean it pretended not to exist. On the coffee table sat a folder the color of a bruised sky, its tab labeled in a neat, careful hand. Property consolidation. "Just standardizing titles," he said, sliding the folder toward me with a pen balanced on top. "Lawyers hate messy paper trails. This keeps everything protected." "Protected from what?" I asked. "From problems," he said, as if that explained it. "You know how the world is." Clara floated in from the kitchen carrying mineral water that sparkled like it had a secret. "Dad, you'll love how simple this is," she sang, setting the glass in front of me. Her perfume arrived before she did. Clean, sharp, Expensive. One signature and the house is shielded. If anything ever happens, we can respond fast. No courts, no delays. She smiled at me like a teacher presenting a gold star to the slowest child. I opened the folder. The first page wore the firm's letterhead like armor. Memorandum of transfer for safety and efficiency, it read. Beneath it, paragraphs of language that moved like a snake. Co-mingled liabilities, assignations of right, mutual relinquishment, words meant to look helpful while their pockets bulged with knives. Why now? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Because it's smart, Matthew said. The firm's estate planner took a look at my portfolio last week. He saw the house is still in your name. That exposes us. Exposes who? I asked. I still live there. He gave a patient sigh. Us, Dad. The family. It's all the same now. Clara leaned on the sofa arm, nails tapping the leather. A slow, soft metronome that counted down a fuse. We're just aligning assets. It helps if there's ever a medical emergency. Her eyes held a gleam that didn't match the mercy in her voice. I flipped to the second page. Schedule A, real property. The address sat there like a living thing pinned to a board. Under it, assigner, my full name, assignee, Matthew's name. Then a clause that seemed innocuous, a gray sentence in a sea of gray. A senior hereby waives and relinquishes all right, title, claim, and interest, present and future, in the real property and in any estate benefits derived therefrom. I felt a tug in my chest like a nail being pulled free. Matthew, I said carefully, this language, waives and relinquishes, what exactly does that mean? He didn't flinch. That's boilerplate. Boilerplate that says I give up my rights to the house, I said, reading it again to be sure the words hadn't gotten bored and changed their minds. It says you're streamlining title, Clara answered smoothly before he could. A clean title is good for refinancing, upgrades, taxes. I pointed at the next sentence. Asiner also agrees to forfeit any expectancy in all testamentary instruments related to the real property and any related assets. And this? Matthew's jaw tightened. Dad, please. I had a paralegal draft it quick. It's standard CYA. If something happens to you, the house and the connected accounts move efficiently. No probate mess. And if nothing happens to me? I said. Silence, thin and mean. He looked at the pen. It's for legal safety. For who? I asked again, softer, because I finally knew the answer, and it hurt worse when whispered. Clara slid onto the sofa beside me, a hand light on my sleeve. For all of us, she said. Look, we've been paying the property taxes anyway. She laughed a little, like generosity. You know how slow the county is with refunds. I turned the page. The signature line wore my name beneath it, a clean blank waiting to become a weapon. Beneath that, a notary block. I recognized the notary's name. She'd once stamped a car title for me after asking about my son, her eyes kind and curious. How's Matthew? She'd said, and I'd said, he's going to change the world. In the margin beside my printed name, a sticky note with Clara's handwriting leaned at a pretty angle. Just sign here, Dad. One step and you're worry-free. I read the whole thing again, slower. The phrases did a neat dance, moving me away from what they were taking. Mutual benefit, efficient administration. A signer acknowledges that this is irrevocable. That one felt like a hand on the back of my neck. I should take this to someone, I said. Another lawyer. Someone neutral. Neutral? Matthew repeated, and for the first time a flash of impatience cracked through the professional glaze. Dad, I am your son. I'm not tricking you. Then you won't mind me understanding what I'm signing, I answered, and tried to make it sound light. It came out like gravel. Clara laughed too brightly. Totally. Of course, She glanced at him. We just have a rate lock on a refinance. There's a timing element. If we miss the window, we eat points. It's not a big deal, but... It's always not a big deal until it is, I said. Matthew rubbed his temple with his thumb. Dad, please, you taught me to be decisive. This is decisive. The firm's planner said every month we wait is risk. What planner? I asked. Carson, he said. Brilliant guy. Does Carson know I still sleep under that roof? I said. That I patched the window with putty when the wind wouldn't quit? That your mother sang in that kitchen? That... Don't, he said, and the word was a blade, quick and clean. Don't make this sentimental. My whole life had been held together by sentiment and nails, by promises and overtime. I stared at his face, the face I used to lift toward the ceiling fan to make him giggle, and saw a man who had replaced his father with a policy. I set the pen down. I won't sign this. Clara's smile cooled by 10 degrees. You don't mean that. I mean it, I said. She leaned forward. Philip, listen. If a creditor ever comes after you for a medical bill, for example, the house could be at stake. This protects you. It protects Matthew. It protects the baby we might... She stopped, let the word baby hang like confetti. Their future colored in, mine erased in pencil. Matthew looked from her to me. I've covered the taxes for years, Dad. I've handled the roof repair, the insurance. I'm not asking you to give me anything I haven't already. Paid for? I said, and the question roared up before I could cage it. Is that what you think? That a house is a ledger and love is a line item? He flinched. Clara's hand touched his sleeve, subtle control disguised as comfort. Something steadied inside me. I took the folder, lifted the top page, and flipped back to that gray sentence, the one that tried to sound harmless while the ink sharpened itself. I pulled a pair of reading glasses from my pocket, the cheap kind you buy near the batteries at the pharmacy. I slid them on and read aloud, each word slow and exact. A signer hereby waives and relinquishes all right, title, claim, and interest. I paused, looked at him. Present and future. He swallowed. You said for legal safety, I said. But what you want is for legal ownership, and for me to sign away the right to be your father on paper, so the day I die, the house nods politely at your will and my name stays quiet. Dad? No, I said, surprising us all with the strength in it. No. I closed the folder and stood. The room felt colder, as if the glass had decided to be ice after all. Outside, the river kept moving, a dark ribbon minding its own relentless business. I'll have someone look at it, I said. Someone that doesn't get paid to agree with you. Clara's nails tapped the sofa again, faster now. Philip, that's really... Prudent, I said. That's the word you were reaching for. Matthew stared at the folder like it had betrayed him. Maybe in his world papers were loyal. In mine they were only ever as honest as the hands that wrote them. I picked up my coat. At the door, he tried one more time. It's for legal safety, he said quietly, almost pleading. You taught me to protect what matters. I looked back at him and felt the old promise rise, the one I'd made to a woman who asked me to keep our son from feeling small. I am, I said, starting with my name. He owes money. He's unstable. The first rumor arrived the way rot does, quiet, sweet, and late. Aunt Lorraine called on a Tuesday with the voice she reserved for deaths and discounts. Philip, honey, are you all right? She stretched the last word like she was holding it with tongs. I'm fine, I said. Why? A pause. Papers rustled. Well, Matthew mentioned you've been playing cards again, like the old days, and there were concerns about cash. I stared at the phone as if it had turned into a stranger. I haven't played a hand since '98, I said, and the most I lost then was a Saturday. Oh, huh. Her voice landed somewhere soft and unbelieving. Well, you know how these things get exaggerated. She cleared her throat. Just be careful. By Thursday, be careful had grown teeth. Cousin Derek posted a photo from a poker night. Green felt, a king of spades caught midair, captioned, Some folks never learn. I hadn't been invited. I hadn't even been near a deck of cards. On Friday, the pastor met me at the church door with a smile that trembled. We're praying for you, he said, and squeezed my shoulder as if testing a bruise. I walked home with the peculiar sensation of being observed from behind blinds. Neighbors with mailboxes suddenly wanted to organize their junk mail. Two teens on bikes slowed down as they passed, then sped up like they'd seen something contagious. By the time I reached the porch, there were 2 envelopes wedged in the doorframe, an anonymous tip about helplines for addiction, and a glossy credit counseling brochure with a sticky note. No shame in getting help. The handwriting looked expensive. I set them on the kitchen table and stared until the clock coughed itself into the next hour. That evening I called Matthew. He picked up on the second ring, voice polished. Dad, can I call you back? I'm with a client. This will be quick, I said. Are you telling people I have a gambling problem? Silence, then the soft, practiced exhale of a man who handles liabilities. I never said problem. I said concerns. Concerns based on what? Dad, Clara heard, from who? He hesitated. People talk. People lie, I said, and heard the old steel in my voice. Did you tell Aunt Lorraine I owe money? I told her we're monitoring things, he said. Because we are. We? I asked. He pivoted. Dad, this isn't an attack. It's an intervention of clarity. I'm clear, I said. I'm clear that someone is planning stories like tulips. He sighed. I'll call you later. He didn't. The next day, I got my answer without asking. At the grocery store, Clara found me by the apples. She wore white even though it threatened rain, the kind of white that makes the world feel underdressed. Philip, she said brightly, as if my name were something on sale. I was just thinking of you. Is that so? I said. She lifted a gala apple, examined it like a jewel, set it back down. We're worried. Money's tight for everyone. Stress does strange things. She let her eyes rake lightly over my hands. You've always worked so hard. Sometimes hard men seek soft escapes. Cards are soft? I asked. Compared to pain, she said, as if she'd swallowed a quote. Listen, there's no judgment, but people notice when bills are late. My bills aren't late, she smiled, pity trimmed in pearl. The county records are public. She slid a folded printout from her bag, property tax delinquency notice, and tapped the date, 2 months old. I remembered the hiccup. Matthew had handled the taxes last cycle. He'd said the county was slow with refunds. The county, it seemed, had been right on time with notices. I didn't get this, I said. It went to the address on file. Her eyes shone. We updated it. We, I repeated, tasting the plural. She tucked the paper back, like a magician stealing a coin. People talked. The sound of rain against the courthouse window felt softer, lighter. Not victory, not yet, but the sound of something beginning to shift. They wanted headlines, Evelyn said. We gave them evidence. And for the first time in months, I felt the balance of power tilt back toward truth. The ink never lies, only people do. The next morning, the courtroom was standing room only. Reporters filled the back rows, pens poised like daggers. Matthew sat at the plaintiff's table with us now, quieter, thinner, his guilt finally outweighing his pride. Across the aisle, Clara looked like she'd slept inside a magazine ad, perfect, poised, brittle, but her eyes had that flicker people get when they know the fire's crawling closer. Evelyn stood. The plaintiff calls Mrs. Ruth Halpern to the stand. An older woman stepped forward, her gray hair tied neatly, posture straight as duty. She wore the modest confidence of someone who'd spent a lifetime signing other people's truths. The bailiff swore her in. Evelyn smiled gently. Mrs. Halpern, are you a licensed notary public? I was, the woman said, for 32 years until my retirement on May 15th of last year. And you personally notarized documents for Mr. Philip Carter on any date after that retirement? No, ma'am, she said firmly. Once I retired, I mailed my seal back to the state licensing board. It's standard procedure. Evelyn nodded, lifting a printed document from her folder, the forged transfer. Mrs. Halpern, do you recognize your name and notary stamp here? The woman leaned closer, squinting through bifocals. That's my name, she said. But that's not my stamp. The date's wrong. The seal number isn't mine. The courtroom murmured. The judge rapped her gavel once. Evelyn paced slowly. To clarify, Mrs. Halpern, on June 3rd, the date of this document, where were you? Florida, she said. Moving in with my daughter. I have the airline ticket and the rental receipt from that week. Your Honor, Evelyn said, turning to the bench, we submit those as corroborating evidence. The judge nodded. Admitted. Evelyn leaned back on the podium. One last question, Mrs. Halpern. What happens to a notary seal once it's retired? It's deactivated in the state database, she said. Any attempt to reuse it after that is considered a felony. The words of felony hung in the air like a final note. Clara's attorney shifted, his pen clattering from his hand. Thank you, Mrs. Halpern, Evelyn said softly. No further questions. Clara's lawyer rose, trying to regain ground. Mrs. Halpern, isn't it possible someone photocopied your seal before you retired? Anything's possible, she said evenly, but not legal, and not invisible. He frowned. Invisible? I use a microdot ink marker, she said. Every document I notarize has a UV signature specific to my pen. The paper you're holding doesn't. Evelyn smiled. Thank you, Mrs. Halpern. The defense lawyer sank into his seat. Clara's mask cracked. For the first time, she wasn't in control. She was cornered. "Your Honor," Evelyn said. "At this point, we move to charge Mrs. Matthews with willful forgery and financial fraud." The judge adjusted her glasses. "Motion noted. The evidence is compelling. A criminal referral will be made following this hearing." Clara slammed her palms against the table. "This is ridiculous. You're all buying into his sob story." "Mrs. Matthews," the judge warned, "control yourself." But she didn't. The calm veneer shattered completely. "He's senile. He's manipulating you all. You think he earned that house? He built it off loans I helped repay. I just wanted what was mine." Her words echoed, jagged and shrill. The courtroom went still. Even Matthew froze. Slowly, he stood. "What was yours?" he said quietly. "You mean my childhood? His years of work? His dignity?" She turned toward him, desperate. "You don't understand." "No," he said, voice breaking. "I finally do." The bailiff stepped forward, hand hovering near Clara's shoulder. The judge's gavel struck twice. "Order. Mrs. Matthews, another outburst and you'll be removed." But she'd already destroyed herself. No lawyer could unring that bell. Evelyn gathered her files calmly, her voice like a knife wrapped in silk. "Your Honor, the plaintiff rests." As the judge adjourned, reporters rushed the aisles. Flashbulbs popped. Clara was led out, face stiff, mascara streaking like ash. Matthew followed in silence, head bowed, his eyes refusing to meet hers. Outside, the sky had turned that strange shade of silver that happens after a storm, half gloom, half grace. I stepped down the courthouse stairs slowly, the air thick with the scent of rain and redemption. Evelyn joined me. "It's almost over," she said. "Almost," I repeated. "But not quite. The truth's been spoken. Now we wait for justice to write the last line." She nodded. "And it will." For the first time in a long while, I believed her. Because even if ink can be forged, conscience cannot, and this time, the ink was finally on my side. When the truth hit the airwaves, silence became her sentence. By dawn, the story was everywhere. Not just in the local gazette this time, but across every major outlet that loved a scandal wrapped in morality. Headlines screamed from glowing screens: "Wife of investment executive charged in elder fraud. Forged signature, family feud, and a fortune. The Carter case unfolds. The father they tried to erase." Someone had pulled the courtroom audio, Clara's outburst, the judge's gavel, Matthew's quiet confession, and uploaded it online. Within hours, it had millions of views, TikTok edits, podcast breakdowns, news anchors shaking their heads solemnly while sipping coffee. They turned my life into a cautionary tale, but for once, I didn't mind. Because every word was true. Evelyn called early that morning. "The Attorney General's office is moving fast," she said. "They've opened a criminal probe. Clara's assets are frozen, her passport's flagged, and the firm's internal ethics board just suspended Matthew pending investigation." I sat on my porch, coffee steaming beside me, morning light cutting across the wood like mercy itself. The silence didn't hurt anymore. It sounded like peace. "You all right?" she asked. I laughed softly. "All right enough." Then after a pause, "You think they'll send her to prison?" Evelyn's tone turned measured. "That's up to the jury. But between the forged notary, the wire trail, and her confession, I'd say she'll spend a long time staring at the kind of walls she can't decorate." I nodded. Somewhere between relief and sorrow there was something heavier, the ache of a man who'd won what he'd never wanted to lose. By midday, the cameras had made their pilgrimage to my front gate. One reporter called out, "Mr. Carter, do you forgive your son?" Another shouted, "How does it feel to get your home back?" I stood there, album still in my hands, the same one that had survived the rain. "It feels," I said, "like justice isn't about getting even. It's about getting heard." They scribbled furiously, hungry for quotes, but that was all I gave them. When I turned to go back inside, Matthew was standing at the edge of the driveway. No cameras pointed at him yet. He'd come quietly. His suit looked looser now, his eyes red, his tie gone. "Dad," he said, voice barely above the breeze, "they suspended me this morning." I nodded. I heard. I gave them everything. The passwords, the ledgers. I told the truth. I know. He hesitated. It doesn't change what I did. No, I said, but it changes what you'll become next. He looked down at the gravel, then back up at me. They want a quote, he said bitterly. Something about remorse. You think I should talk? Talk if you mean it, I said. The world doesn't need more words. It needs repentance that doesn't trend. He winced, but didn't argue. Then he reached into his pocket and held out a small metal keychain. A miniature replica of the house, something I'd given him when he was 12. I found this, he said. I kept it through college. I don't know why. I took it carefully. The metal was warm from his palm. Maybe you knew someday you'd have to return it. He nodded, tears forming but not falling. I'm sorry, Dad. I thought I was protecting what you built. No, I said softly. You were protecting what she wanted. He swallowed. Can I come inside? I looked past him at the cameras down the street, the world still watching. Then I stepped aside. You can come home, but this time you walk in as a man, not as a name on a deed. That night, as the headlines rolled across every network and Clara's mugshot flickered across the screen, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt still. For the first time in years, the house didn't whistle when the wind passed through. It just stood there, solid, whole, like it remembered who built it. And for the first time, I slept without checking if the locks held. Because the truth, once spoken loud enough, becomes its own kind of security. Reputation falls faster than any verdict. 3 days later, the world turned Clara Matthews into a headline, a villain, and then a ghost, all before noon. The morning shows ran her photo beside slick graphics and somber music. Commentators called it a betrayal born of greed. Talk shows debated whether forgery within family estates was the new silent epidemic. The same socialites who used to toast her at charity galas now pretended they'd never known her name. That's how it works. When a lie collapses, everyone rushes to trample the dust. Evelyn sent me a stack of articles she didn't want me to read but knew I would anyway. One headline cut deeper than the rest. Clara's empire implodes. Investors demand refunds. Board cites ethical catastrophe. By the end of the week, her company had bled every major client. The PR firm resigned. Her financial accounts were locked, and her phone, according to Matthew, had gone eerily silent, except for one persistent caller, the district attorney's office. He came by again that night, not in a suit this time, just jeans, an old jacket, and that lost look he'd worn since the trial began. I heard she moved into her sister's basement, he said quietly. Reporters camp outside. They're calling her the Queen of Counterfeit. I poured 2 cups of coffee, set one in front of him. Justice works faster when guilt keeps it company. He didn't smile. You think I should be happy about that? No, I said. Just awake. He rubbed his face, the sound of stubble rough against skin. They froze my joint accounts too. I can't even pay rent. Feels like I'm the one on trial now. You were, I said. And you told the truth. That's the first payment of any redemption. He stared into his coffee. I didn't even see it happening. She'd tell me what forms to sign, what clients to meet, how our brand depended on perfection. I thought she was saving us time. Turns out she was buying her way into hell. You gave her the key, I said, but you can choose not to follow her inside. He looked up at me then, not as a defendant, not as a son begging forgiveness, but as a man starting over. I want to make it right, Dad, not just legally. Really right. Then start small, I said. Truth doesn't need press releases. The next morning, the New York Ledger ran a new story, this time written by a reporter I hadn't spoken to. The headline read, Matthew Carter, From Betrayal to Accountability. In it, Matthew gave a statement I didn't expect. My father built something from nothing. I tried to make it bigger and made it uglier. This is me learning that wealth without honesty is just theft in better clothes. It wasn't a plea, it was a confession in print. And for the first time, the comments under the article weren't venomous. They were quiet, thoughtful. Some even said brave. Evelyn called later that day. He did good, she said. That article shifts the narrative, from scandal to repentance. It'll help at sentencing. Sentencing? I asked. For Clara. The DA's pushing fast-tracked prosecution, but they'll want Matthew's cooperation during her plea deal. He'll testify again. I nodded slowly. He's strong enough now. Because of you, she said. No, I replied. Because of what I didn't do. I didn't give up on him. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Philip, there's someone who wants to talk to you. Someone from your old factory days. Says he remembers you bringing Matthew to work sometimes. The name hit me like a warm echo. Harold Green. Foreman. Mentor. The man who used to say, a house is only as honest as the man who hammers it. Evelyn continued, he's been following your case. He's starting a nonprofit for senior fraud victims. Wants you to help lead it. I didn't answer right away. The idea felt like sunlight after too many gray mornings. Finally, I said, tell him yes. That night, I sat back on the porch, the house behind me glowing soft in the lamplight. Matthew was inside, cleaning out the attic, finding old photos, things I'd buried long before the betrayal. Somewhere downtown, Clara's lawyer was probably filing motions and delays. But out here, on this porch, her lies no longer reached, because reputation once built on deceit falls faster than gravity allows, and mine, rebuilt on truth, was finally standing again. Justice doesn't shout, it signs its name and walks away. 2 months later, the courthouse was crowded again, not with cameras this time, but with people who had followed the story and wanted to see how it ended. The press called it the sentencing of the year. For me, it was just Tuesday. Clara sat at the defense table in gray prison garb, her hair tied back, her face stripped of the confidence that once could silence a room. She looked smaller, sharper, like ambition without its costume. When the judge entered, everyone rose, then silence. You could almost hear the gavel breathe before it struck. Mrs. Clara Matthews, the judge said, you have been found guilty of fraud, forgery, and elder financial abuse. You manipulated trust, falsified records, and nearly destroyed the man who raised the family you married into. Clara's eyes flicked to me once, quick, venomous, then away. The judge continued, her voice even and cold. This court sentences you to 7 years in state custody and restitution in full to Mr. Philip Carter. 7 years. It wasn't vengeance. It was punctuation. The courtroom buzzed, reporters scribbling, but I didn't move. Evelyn put a hand on my shoulder. You did it, she whispered. No, I said quietly. The truth did. As bailiffs led Clara away, Matthew stood. He hadn't been required to attend, but he came anyway. He turned to the gallery of cameras waiting for quotes and said softly, I won't speak for her. Only for me. I was complicit. By silence, by pride. My father deserves peace, not pity. I hope this verdict gives him both. He didn't look at me when he said it, but I felt it anyway. That fragile bridge being rebuilt, plank by plank. 2 weeks later, I stood behind a podium at a modest press event for the launch of Harold Green's new organization, the Franklin Foundation, Legal Aid for Senior Fraud Victims. It was held in a community center that smelled faintly of paint and coffee. Nothing fancy. Just real. The crowd wasn't big. A few reporters, a handful of volunteers, some retirees who'd heard about that old man who fought back and won. Harold introduced me simply. This man taught the world that the elderly aren't powerless, just too polite to fight loud. When I stepped up to the microphone, my hands didn't shake. I'm not a lawyer, I began. Not a politician. I built things, tables, walls, fences. I never thought I'd have to build a case. A ripple of soft laughter moved through the room. I smiled faintly. They tried to take my home. But home isn't just wood and nails. It's the truth you refuse to sell, even when you're offered comfort in exchange. I looked down at the front row where Matthew sat quietly, eyes low, wearing the same jacket he'd worn the night he came back home. My son once told me that business was about control. I told him it's about conscience. One makes you powerful, the other lets you sleep. The room went still, the kind of stillness where words stop being sound and start being weight. Then I lifted the small brass key I carried on a chain around my neck, the one he'd given back to me in the driveway. I keep this to remind myself that nothing built on betrayal stays standing, but if you build with integrity, even the rain can't wash you away. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then rolling through the room like thunder's gentler cousin. Harold shook my hand. Evelyn smiled. Matthew wiped his eyes when he thought no one was looking. For a brief second, I felt something close to forgiveness brush past me. Light, fleeting, but real. When I stepped outside afterward, the sky was wide and clean. Reporters waited again, but their tone had changed. "Mr. Carter, one word for the record?" one asked. I thought about it, then said simply, "Justice," and I walked away. The courtroom looked different this time, not because the walls had changed, but because I had. The same oak benches, the same smell of varnish and anxiety, but now the seat that once felt like a witness box felt more like a front row seat to the closing of a wound. This was the final hearing, the civil verdict. The moment the court would decide restitution, damages, and the last official word on my name. Evelyn stood beside me, calm as ever. Her briefcase was worn at the corners now, like something that had been in too many fights but still refused to break. "This is it, Philip," she said. "The end of their story, and the beginning of yours." Across the aisle, Matthew sat alone this time. No lawyers, no wife, just him. He'd waived counsel for this hearing, said he wanted to face it clean. When the judge entered, he stood straight, shoulders squared, not out of pride, but respect. The clerk read the title like a requiem. Philip Carter versus Matthew Carter et al., that et al., and others used to sound like armor for him. Today, it sounded like distance. Evelyn presented first. "Your Honor, my client was robbed not only of his property, but of his dignity. What the defendants forged was not just a document, but trust itself. And trust, unlike land, cannot be rebuilt with tools. It takes truth and time." She laid out the damages simply: the cost of the home, the funds stolen through Claire's company, the emotional and physical distress from displacement. Then she added one thing I hadn't expected, a request for the court to recognize restorative community service for Matthew in lieu of further financial penalties. I turned to her, surprised. She whispered, "Sometimes mercy proves guilt louder than punishment." The judge nodded thoughtfully, then called Matthew to the stand. He walked slowly, as though each step were a reckoning. His face was pale, his hands empty. "Mr. Carter," the judge began, "do you wish to make a final statement before this court?" He took a breath, a long one, and spoke, voice steady, eyes fixed on me. "I grew up watching my father build things. Furniture, houses, people's trust. I thought I could build something bigger, but all I built was a wall between us." He paused. "I let ambition speak louder than love. I thought success could erase the smell of sawdust. I thought titles made me a man. But the truth is, I only became one when I stood here and said I was wrong." He turned toward me fully then. "I can't undo what I signed. I can't unsay what I said. But I can promise the next years of my life will be spent fixing what I broke, starting with helping others who were silenced like I tried to silence you." He swallowed hard. "I'm sorry, Dad. Not for getting caught. For forgetting who raised me." The room stayed silent. Even the clicking of reporters' pens had stopped. The judge folded her hands. "Mr. Carter, the court recognizes your statement and the sincerity within it." She turned to me. "Mr. Philip Carter, do you wish to respond?" I stood, legs heavier than they should have been, voice quiet but sure. "When he was 5, I said, Matthew built his first birdhouse. The nails were crooked, the paint uneven, but he was proud of it. I told him it was perfect, not because it was, but because he built it with heart." Somewhere along the way, he forgot that part. I looked at my son, not at the man who'd betrayed me, but the boy who once believed everything good could be built with 2 hands and a little faith. "I forgive him," I said, not to excuse what he did, but because carrying anger is just another kind of theft. The judge's gavel struck once, firm and final. "This court orders restitution in full to Mr. Carter, as outlined in the settlement. The civil case is closed." Evelyn touched my shoulder gently. "It's over," she whispered. "No," I said softly, watching Matthew lower his head, tears spilling onto the table. "It's just finally honest." The courthouse emptied slowly that day. Lawyers packed their files, reporters chased quotes, and for the first time in months, my name wasn't being shouted or scribbled. It was being closed. Matthew walked beside me down the marble steps, the echo of our shoes sounding like 2 halves of one heartbeat out of rhythm. The air smelled faintly of rain again, the sky caught between silver and blue, like it hadn't decided whether to mourn or to heal. "Dad," he said quietly, "I don't know what to do now." "You start small," I said. "You learn to build without taking." He nodded, eyes down. Evelyn told me the foundation's looking for volunteers, legal aid, outreach, community education. I smiled faintly. You think you could work for your old man again? He gave a half laugh, half sob. If you'll have me. I never stopped, I said. That afternoon we drove together to the Franklin Foundation, the small brick building Harold had rented, where hope smelled like paper, coffee, and second chances. Inside, Evelyn was already knee-deep in case files, mentoring a group of interns who looked too young to know what betrayal even meant. When she saw us, she smiled. You two are just in time. We've got a pile of calls from seniors afraid to trust their own families with bank accounts. Seems your story turned into a wake-up call. Good, I said. Let's make it a classroom instead. She motioned to the stack of letters on her desk. Start there, Matthew. Every one of these people thinks they're alone. Tell them they're not. He nodded, rolling up his sleeves, and for the first time since this began, I saw something familiar in his expression. Not arrogance, not guilt, but focus, the kind he used to have when he built that crooked birdhouse at 5 years old. I turned to leave, but Evelyn called after me. Philip, wait. She handed me an envelope, cream-colored, sealed neatly. The clerk forwarded this from the court. Came this morning. I opened it slowly. Inside was a brief letter. Handwritten. The signature at the bottom. Clara, Philip, you won. I lost. But between those two sentences lies everything I don't know how to explain. I didn't steal because I was hungry. I stole because I was afraid. I thought money could make permanence. I see now it only bought noise. Tell Matthew I hope he finds silence again. Prison's quiet enough for both of us. See. I folded the letter and slipped it into my pocket without a word. Some things didn't need answers, only endings. When I stepped outside, the sun had pushed through the clouds. Across the street, Matthew was helping an older woman out of her car, holding an umbrella steady over her head. She thanked him, called him dear, and he smiled. Not the kind that sold charm, but the kind that came from somewhere deep and clean. Watching him, I thought of all the years I'd carried anger like armor, heavy, loud, proud, and for the first time, I felt it loosen, drop quietly to the ground. Harold joined me on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets. You did good, Philip, he said. Not just winning, teaching. I didn't teach, I said. I just remembered what my father taught me, that integrity's the only inheritance worth leaving. He chuckled. Then maybe you finally passed it on. We stood there for a moment, two old men watching a son rediscover humility in real time. The world still spun with noise, headlines, trials, the endless hum of human mistakes. But here, it was still. Matthew waved from across the street. We could use another set of hands, Dad. I raised a brow. You mean the old ones? He laughed. They still build straighter than mine. And so I crossed. Not to fix a house, not to win a war, but to stand beside my son again. In the sunlight, in the aftermath. In the only place justice can ever truly lead, home. 6 months later, the courthouse that once held my nightmares hosted something different, a public forum on ethics, family, and financial trust. The Franklin Foundation had been invited to speak, and Evelyn insisted I take the podium. You're the reason this place exists, she said. People need to hear the ending from the man who lived it. So I stood there again, under the same chandeliers that had once glared down on my humiliation. But this time, there were no lawyers, no gavel, no opposing tables, just rows of faces, strangers, survivors, sons, daughters, all waiting for something they couldn't name. Matthew sat in the front row beside Evelyn, notebook in hand, listening the way people listen when silence has taught them more than words ever did. I adjusted the microphone. 6 months ago, I began, I walked into this room feeling like a ghost in my own life. My name was stolen. My home was stolen. And the thief wasn't a stranger. It was my own blood. A few people shifted in their seats. No one looked away. I used to think betrayal was the worst thing a person could live through. But it's not. I paused, letting the air hold the weight. The worst thing is forgetting who you are in the middle of it. I almost did. Behind me a slideshow flickered to life. Evelyn's idea. Photos from the early days of the foundation. Volunteers helping seniors file claims. Matthew speaking at workshops. the first recovered check handed back to an old widow who'd thought she'd lost everything. When I started this journey, I said, I wanted revenge. I thought justice meant seeing someone else fall. But somewhere between the courthouse steps and the nights I couldn't sleep, I realized something. Justice isn't about falling. It's about standing. Standing for what's right. Standing again when no one thinks you can. I looked toward my son. Matthew lost everything the same day I got my house back. And yet, he shows up every morning to rebuild what really mattered. His word, his integrity, his humanity. He lowered his eyes, and I saw the same boy I once carried on my shoulders, now carrying his own redemption. Clara once wrote me a letter from prison, I continued. She said she stole because she was afraid. That money was her way of making permanence. But money doesn't make permanence. Truth does. The room was still. No coughs, no whispers, just the kind of silence that feels sacred. Some of you out there, I said, looking at the older faces in the crowd, you're afraid too. Afraid to question your children, your caregivers, your accountants. You think distrust is ungrateful. It's not. It's survival. I let that linger, then softened. But forgiveness, that's survival too. Because carrying anger won't fix what they broke. It'll just break what's left of you. Applause rose, slow but steady. I smiled faintly, raising the small brass key that hung around my neck. This was once the symbol of everything I lost. Now it's a reminder of what I found again. That family isn't made by inheritance or last names or shared walls. It's made by respect and love. The applause grew louder. Not wild, not performative, just warm. The kind that feels like understanding. When I stepped down, Matthew stood waiting. He hugged me. Not the stiff, careful kind, but the way he used to when he was 10 and didn't care who was watching. You did good, Dad, he whispered. So did you, I said. Evelyn joined us, smiling through the noise. You two ready for your next case? Matthew grinned. Who's the client? She handed him a folder. A retired teacher from Tulsa. Her nephew drained her account. Says she saw your interview online and decided not to stay quiet. He opened it, scanning the details. We'll help her. I looked at him. My son, once the cause of my greatest pain, now the proof of my greatest lesson. We will, I said. As we walked out of the courthouse together, the evening sun fell across the steps in long, golden stripes. The same stairs where I once stood alone now carried 3 shadows instead of 1. Somewhere behind us, a janitor locked the courtroom doors, the same ones that had echoed with lies and confessions, but this time the sound wasn't final. It was closure, because the truth had already walked out ahead of us, steady and whole, and this time it had my name on it. When the world stops clapping, you hear what you really are. The cell was smaller than Clara imagined, 8 feet by 10, with walls the color of watered-down regret. The window didn't open. It just framed the same patch of gray sky, as though God himself had stopped visiting. On her first night, the air smelled of bleach and apology. She sat on the narrow cot, staring at her reflection in the scratched metal mirror. The woman looking back wasn't the one who used to glide through boardrooms and cocktail parties. That woman wore diamond earrings and indifference. This one wore state-issued gray and a silence that wouldn't leave. They called her the heiress con, though she'd never been anyone's heir. Just a fraud who'd learned how to look expensive. Her cellmate, a woman named Nora, asked her on the second day, "So what'd you do?" Clara tried to answer with her old tone, cool, dismissive, but the words stumbled. "Paperwork mistake." Nora snorted. "We all made paperwork mistakes. Some of us just forgot to hide the evidence." That night, Clara lay awake listening to the sound of distant coughing, someone crying, a guard's footsteps fading down the hall. For the first time, she didn't dream of freedom. She dreamed of silence, the kind that doesn't need defending. Outside, the world she built was crumbling faster than any sentence could measure. Her business partners disavowed her. Her lawyer filed for bankruptcy. And the charity she once fronted, the one that promised to empower women through wealth, had removed her face from its website. Reporters moved on to fresher scandals. The world that had once cheered her now pretended she'd never existed. That's the thing about fame built on illusion. When the lights go out, there's nothing left to illuminate. She tried writing letters, to investors, to her sister, even to Matthew. Most came back stamped return to sender. Only one got a reply. Clara, there's nothing I can say that will make this right. But I can tell you this. I still remember the night you said money could make permanence. You were wrong. Only truth does that. Maybe you'll find some where you are. Philip. She read it every morning, until the folds tore and the ink began to fade. One afternoon, while scrubbing the cafeteria floor, she overheard two guards talking near the kitchen door. Did you see the news? That old guy, Carter, he's starting some national campaign. Foundation's growing fast. Yeah, his son's on the board now. Hell of a redemption story. She froze, rag in hand, heart thudding with something she didn't recognize. Pride, maybe, or envy, or both. That night she sat at the metal desk in her cell and wrote another letter. This one she didn't send. Matthew, you were right to leave. I built everything to prove I mattered, and I ended up proving I didn't. I used fear to control, love to manipulate, truth to decorate lies. I thought I was teaching you strength, but I was only teaching you to hide. Your father won because he never stopped being small in the right ways. Grounded, steady, human. Maybe one day you'll understand what that costs. She folded it neatly and placed it under the thin mattress, her own private confession. Weeks blurred into months. The routine was relentless. 5 a.m. Wake up, chores, lunch line, the hum of sameness that makes even guilt feel repetitive. But there was one moment each day that she looked forward to. Mail call. Most days, nothing. Until one morning, a guard tossed an envelope through the slot. No return address, just two words. For what it's worth. Inside was a single page. I read your last letter, Mom. You were right about one thing. Fear built the world we lived in. But I'm done living there. Dad forgave me. I'm trying to forgive you. That's all I can give right now. Matthew. Her hands trembled. Tears stained the bottom edge of the page, blurring the ink. It wasn't absolution, but it was oxygen. For the first time since the verdict, Clara cried. Not the elegant tears of self-pity, but the kind that come from finally seeing the truth too clearly to look away. When the guard passed by, she asked quietly, "Can I get another piece of paper?" He handed her one. She began to write again, this time not to defend, but to confess. To the dozens of people she'd wronged through her schemes, to the clients she'd misled, even to herself. Each word felt like a small shovel, digging her way back to decency. By spring, she'd joined the prison literacy program, helping other inmates write their own letters, apologies, appeals, sometimes just unsent goodbyes. The irony wasn't lost on her. The woman who once used words to deceive now used them to heal. One day, Nora asked, "You think anyone out there still cares who you are?" Clara smiled faintly. "No, but maybe they'll care who I become." And for once, she meant it. Meanwhile, beyond those gray walls, the foundation thrived. Matthew's outreach project, the Honest Home Initiative, had already helped more than 100 elderly victims reclaim their property rights. Evelyn oversaw the legal side, while I handled the human one, teaching trust the way other men teach carpentry, slow, patient, with both hands steady. When a journalist asked if I ever thought about Clara, I said every day, but not with hate. You can't rebuild with nails of bitterness. They printed that quote under the headline, "The Man Who Forgave His Thief." I didn't correct them, let them call it forgiveness. To me, it was survival, because peace, like justice, isn't given. It's built, one truth at a time. Some debts are paid in time, the hardest are paid in truth. Winter came early the second year, not on the calendar, but in Clara's bones. The concrete held the cold like a grudge. Frost filmed the window till the outside world turned into a smear of gray. On mornings like that, the women in D Block shuffled faster to the chow line, breath fogging, hands tucked into sleeves that never fit. Clara kept a routine now, not for control, but for survival. Wake up at 5, make the bed tight enough to bounce a coin, 5 minutes of quiet with the small paperback Bible from the chapel library, the spine cracked in psalms, then letters, always letters. At first they were apologies, stiff, formal, the kind of contrition that sounds like it's auditioning for mercy. Over months they changed. She started naming things. I forged. I lied. I weaponized trust. She listed dates. She traced wires. She enclosed copies of repayments, however small, from prison wages that looked like typos. Most checks were symbolic, $2 and change, 10 on a good month. But the act hardened into a discipline. For every 1,000 she had stolen in the free world, she would send one honest dollar back from captivity. It wouldn't balance the ledger. It might, one day, balance the soul that wrote it. Nora watched her work and shook her head. "You're a strange one," she said, folding laundry with fingers gone raw in the winter air. "You write like you're repairing a bridge you'll never cross." Clara smiled without looking up. "Maybe the crossing isn't for me." Mid-January, the warden called her to an office that smelled like old coffee and clipped second chances. "You've been flagged for early parole consideration," he said, glasses low on his nose. "Program participation, 0 infractions, victim restitution attempts. On paper, you're the poster child." She knew what she should feel. Relief, hunger for the door. But it didn't arrive. "And off paper?" she asked. "Off paper," he said. "You have a state attorney who wants you to sit the full term to send a message. You also have a victim whose foundation happens to be teaching our inmates how not to become defendants twice." He studied her face. "What do you want, Mrs. Matthews?" Clara took a breath. "If I leave early just because I'm good at performing remorse, I'll be outside and still be here." She gestured at the walls. "I'll petition for parole only if the people I harmed don't object. Especially him. The court will notify all registered victims," the warden said. "They'll get a chance to respond." She nodded, heart pounding at a name she didn't say. Philip. She pictured his porch, the brass key against his chest on a chain, the judge's gavel, the moment everything expensive in her life suddenly looked cheap. That night, she wrote again, not to the court, not to the board, but to the man whose refusal to break had taught her how. "Philip, it is winter here, the kind that knocks air out of you before you speak. I'm up for parole. I am not asking you to support it. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm writing because I promised myself I would not do one more thing in this life without naming it to the person I hurt most. The money mattered to me because it could be counted. The power mattered because people mistook it for love. I built a life out of numbers that couldn't hold me when the room went quiet. You built yours out of promises that did. If I stay, I will keep paying in the only currency left to me, time and truth. If I go, I will keep paying in the only way that won't be performative, work no one sees. Either way, you owe me nothing. For what it's worth, thank you for keeping a human being alive in a place that should have turned me to stone. Clara." She folded the paper, sealed it with hands that no longer shook when they told the truth, and sent it through the slot. A week later, Matthew stood in the visitation room, palms pressed to the glass, eyes older than his years. He hadn't come in months. When he did, it was to talk logistics, statements, testimony. This visit was different. He didn't lead with defense or despair. He led with news. "Dad didn't file an objection," he said softly. Clara's breath caught. "He didn't endorse it?" "He didn't endorse it," Matthew repeated. He wrote one line in his response. "Let the board decide on the facts." "I've already decided on my piece." Clara lowered her eyes. "Peace," she said, tasting the word like a foreign food. "Does he—" "He doesn't hate you," Matthew said. "Not anymore. He doesn't love what you did, but hates a mortgage he won't pay." Clara laughed then, a short, shocked sound that made 2 guards glance over. "I taught you to negotiate anything," she said. "Your father taught you one thing that can't be negotiated." "Conscience," Matthew said. "Conscience," she echoed. They talked in circles after that. Small things, weather, prison food, the new suit he wore from a thrift store and was proud of, the older woman he'd helped last week whose grandson had emptied her account with a smile. Before he left, Matthew pressed his palm to the glass again. "If you get out," he said, "don't come look for me at the foundation. Come find me at the church on 3rd Street. We serve dinner on Tuesdays. You can hand a plate to someone who expects nothing." For the first time since her arrest, Clara felt something stretch toward a shape she couldn't quite name. Not hope, not yet, something like it. The parole hearing felt less like a door and more like a mirror. A panel with measured faces read from her file. Participation, letters of apology, the literacy program, the checks that would never total enough but kept coming anyway. A victim statement was entered on the record. Not from Philip, he'd already sent his single sentence, but from a widow in Indiana whose escrow Clara had siphoned. The woman's voice trembled and then steadied. I can't tell you to free her. I can tell you that every month a letter came with $10 and an explanation I didn't demand. It didn't fix my life. It fixed something smaller. The part of me that believes people can change. When they asked if Clara wished to speak, she stood. I spent my life confusing applause with absolution, she said. I don't deserve release because I learned new words for old wrongs. I deserve the time this board thinks I need to become someone who won't harm anyone if no one's watching. If you keep me, I'll keep paying in truth and labor. If you release me, I'll keep paying by choosing quiet, useful work. Either way, I am done taking. They recessed for 40 minutes. The clock on the wall ticked like a drip in an empty room. When they returned, the chair cleared her throat. Parole is granted with conditions: halfway house placement, employment with approved nonprofit, continued restitution efforts, and no contact with victims except through formal channels. The words landed without fanfare, no applause, no cinematic swell. Clara nodded, a small motion that felt like a mountain shifting. When she signed the forms, her hand didn't shake. The halfway house smelled like detergent and possibility. The bed was narrower than prison, the window wider. She took the first job offered, not at a desk or a podium, but at the church on 3rd Street, washing pans and stacking trays. On her first Tuesday, she stood in a line of volunteers wearing hairnets and humility. When Matthew walked in, he didn't hug her. He handed her a ladle. Chicken or vegetable? He asked. Vegetable, she said, and meant it as a vow. They served in silence for an hour, hands moving in a rhythm that made words optional. The faces that passed were tired, grateful, suspicious, thankful, a catalog of needs that don't have PR teams. After the line thinned, Matthew sat with her at a scratch table. Dad's at a workshop tonight, he said. He'll hear you're out. He won't ask where you are. He'll assume you're where you should be. She nodded, eyes on the floor. I am. They need someone to keep the books, he added. Not manage anything. Just count what comes in and make sure it goes out where it should. With 2 signatures on every release. You and Mrs. Alvarez. She trusts spreadsheets more than people. Clara smiled. Smart woman. She is, he said. It's why she'll trust you only slowly. Good, Clara said. I don't trust me quickly either. Spring loosened the city's jaw. Tulips showed up where the snow had been lazy. On a Thursday, a letter arrived at the halfway house in Phillips Square, measured hand. Clara, I heard. I'm not sending advice, only boundaries. Do your work. Keep your head down. Don't make your change my burden to certify. If you need an accounting question answered for the church, write to Evelyn through the foundation. She'll help if it helps others, that's all. Philip. Clara read it twice, then folded it like something sacred. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. The line between them had stopped being a rope for tug-of-war. It had become a guardrail. On the anniversary of her arrest, Clara went back to the courthouse, not inside, just to the steps. She stood as the sun slid down the face of the building and let herself remember in full color the forged stamp, the wire transfers, the outburst that sounded like a woman trying to drown the truth in her own voice. She didn't flinch away. A familiar figure joined her. Evelyn, a folder under her arm, hair pulled back, eyes that could parse a lie a mile away. You're not supposed to have contact, Evelyn said carefully. I won't write him, Clara replied. I came to say something to the air and let it pick sides. Evelyn tilted her head. Say it then. Clara faced the doors she'd once stormed. I stole because I believed fear more than love. I lied because it's faster than building. I hurt a man who wouldn't harm me back. I'm sorry. Not the kind of sorry that asks for movement. The kind that stands still and works. Evelyn considered her a long moment. Then work, she said gently, and when you're tired, keep working. Clara nodded. I will. Are you, well? Evelyn asked, the word careful. No, Clara said, but I'm honest. Evelyn almost smiled. That's a beginning. They stood a while longer, watching the light turn the courthouse a color Clara had never noticed. Not gray, not gold. Something earned. That night in the halfway house, lights out at 10, Clara lay awake and listened. No keys, no cuffs, no roll call. Just the slow breath of women trying again. She reached under the mattress and pulled out the first letter she'd never sent, the one to Matthew about fear and permanence. She tore it gently, not out of shame, but because it had served its purpose. The new life didn't need a museum of the old one. She wrote one last letter, not to send, to keep. To whoever I was, you built a palace out of receipts. You kept the lights on with applause. You forgot, in all that brightness, what a real morning looks like. Here is a new one. A line of strangers, a ladle, a ledger that balances at the end of the day without stealing from tomorrow. You are retired. I am hired in your place, whoever I am becoming. She placed it where the old Apologius had lived and slept for the first time without dreaming of doors, because some debts are paid in time, the hardest are paid in truth. And Clara, the woman who once counterfeited permanence, finally understood the only thing that lasts, work done in the open, with hands that don't hide. Guilt doesn't fade, it just learns to whisper. Matthew hadn't slept a full night in months, not since the sentencing. Not since the day he watched his mother disappear behind those gray courthouse doors. By day, he worked at the foundation, answering calls, drafting reports, sitting in meetings beside his father and Evelyn. They never treated him like a criminal. That somehow made it harder. Every smile felt like a mercy he didn't deserve. Every good deed felt like a receipt he couldn't pay off. He lived in a small apartment above a hardware store now, the kind that smelled faintly of sawdust, like an unintentional echo of his childhood. On nights when the air was too still, he swore he could still hear the sound of his father's hammer, that rhythmic, patient tap 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 that used to fill their weekends. But the sound in his dreams was different. It wasn't wood being built, it was something being buried. Some nights he'd wake drenched in sweat, convinced the walls were closing in, that the ceiling fan above him was a pendulum counting down his guilt. He stopped drinking coffee after dark, stopped reading news about the case. But guilt has a way of staying on the line long after you hang up. In his nightmares, his mother's voice always came first. Erase his name. Then the paper, the pen, the silence that followed. He'd wake up gasping, gripping the sheets like they might steady him against something invisible. Sometimes he'd get up and stand by the window, watching the city breathe. He'd see people heading home from late shifts, headlights washing over wet pavement, lives that kept moving, untouched by what he'd done. He'd whisper, "You deserve sleep," but it never came. One Friday evening, after staying late to file donor reports, Evelyn found him still at his desk. The office was quiet, lit only by the low hum of the vending machine. "You ever go home?" she asked gently. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm still figuring out what home means." She leaned on the doorframe, watching him close a spreadsheet. "You're punishing yourself harder than the court ever could." He shrugged. The court didn't raise him. Evelyn stepped closer. "Matthew, listen to me. You can't rebuild the past. You can only be useful in the present." "I'm trying," he said, voice cracking. "But every time I walk into that office, every time someone shakes my hand, I see his face, the day I told the lawyer to erase his name. I can still hear how calm I sounded, like it was just paperwork." Evelyn's eyes softened. "You can't change what you were, but you can outgrow it." He exhaled shakily. "You think he believes that?" "He doesn't need to," she said. "He already lives it." She left him with that thought. Small, heavy, and impossible to shake. That night, he walked home through the drizzle. The streetlights made everything glisten, the kind of beauty that hurts because it's temporary. When he reached the apartment, he sat at his kitchen table and opened a blank notebook. On the first page, he wrote a date, June 3rd, the day I signed away my father. Below it, he began listing moments. Not excuses, just the anatomy of a downfall. The first time I called betrayal strategy. The first time I let silence do my lying. The day I looked at my father and saw inconvenience instead of sacrifice. He wrote until his hand cramped, until the ink smudged from sweat and tears. Then he turned the page and began something new. To the man I wronged more than anyone, the man who taught me to build, not own. He stopped there. He wasn't ready yet, but the words felt like the first step of something sacred, a confession that didn't ask to be absolved, only understood. Over the next few weeks, he started writing every night. Not for publication, not for forgiveness, just to make the noise inside his head audible enough to face. Each entry was a reckoning. Today, I caught myself measuring worth again. In numbers, not people. I stopped before I finished the math. Today, I saw a client cry on the phone. I didn't promise her miracles, I just listened. Dad does that. Now I know why it works. Today, I walked past the house. I didn't go in, but I didn't cross the street either. The notebook grew heavier with ink, but lighter in meaning. Every sentence stripped another layer of arrogance. Every paragraph replaced shame with something steadier, humility. One Sunday afternoon, while helping at the church soup line, he overheard two volunteers talking. "Did you hear about that guy from the Carter case?" one whispered. "The son who helped steal from his dad?" "Yeah," the other said. "He's working here now. Imagine living with that kind of guilt." Matthew kept ladling soup, silent. Then one of the women added quietly, "But he's still here, every week. Maybe guilt isn't the worst thing. Maybe it's proof you've still got a soul." That sentence followed him home like a benediction. That night he opened his notebook again. The pages rustled like soft applause. He wrote, "Guilt means I remember, but memory's not punishment, it's direction. It tells me where not to go again." He closed the book, exhaled, and for the first time in months, slept without dreaming of paper and signatures. You can't rewrite the past, but you can edit who you become. Spring came early that year. The foundation's garden bloomed in uneven colors: marigolds, daisies, a patch of mint that refused to stay in its lane. Every morning Matthew watered them before work. "They grow better when you don't hover," his father had said once. He was learning that applied to people too. Philip still didn't say much. They worked side by side now, father and son, quiet, efficient. Every conversation was practical: invoices, schedules, case files. But beneath the silence, something alive moved. A truce made not of words, but rhythm. Sometimes, during lunch breaks, Matthew would glance at him across the small office table. His father still wore the same watch from 30 years ago, the band worn thin but ticking steady. Consistency, he thought. That's what redemption looks like when you stop performing it. But at night, the guilt still visited, softer now, not as a nightmare, more like an echo that refused to leave a room. And in that echo, there was always one question: does he know I'm trying? So one night in April, Matthew opened his notebook again, the one filled with half confessions, unfinished thoughts, and began writing something different. Not a journal, a letter, not to ask, to show. "Dad, I've spent the last year learning how to do something you mastered decades ago: live with yourself. It sounds simple, but it's the hardest thing I've ever done. When I wake up, I still hear it sometimes, the sound of the pen scratching your name off that document. That sound used to define me, now it reminds me of what I won't repeat. You once said that integrity isn't inherited, it's practiced. I used to think legacy meant ownership, houses, businesses, titles. But it's really just a trail of choices that someone else has to follow. You left me a good trail. I got lost in it for a while." He paused, staring at the words until the ink dried. Then he kept going. "The foundation is growing. We reached 600 victims this quarter, 600 people who thought their stories didn't matter. We listened, and for some reason, they believed us. Evelyn says empathy isn't taught, it's transferred. I think she learned that from you. I see the way you look at people when they talk, not waiting to respond, just holding space for what they need to say. I used to think that was passivity. Now I understand it's courage, to stand still while someone else unravels. Mom's letter came last month. I didn't know whether to read it. I did. She said she's learning to live small. Maybe that's what she should have done all along. I'm not angry anymore, just aware." He leaned back, listening to the hum of the city outside his window. Traffic, laughter, a siren somewhere far away, the sounds of life continuing without permission. He kept writing. "You told me once that trust isn't about being right. It's about staying honest when it's inconvenient." That line used to annoy me. Now I repeat it to clients who don't believe in recovery. Some of them cry, some just nod. Either way, it works. I won't ask for forgiveness. You've already given me more than that: time, proximity, a second chance to prove I'm not the same man who walked into that lawyer's office. I know I can't erase what I did, but I can build something where the damage was, brick by brick, like you taught me." He stopped again, the pen hovering. Then quietly he wrote the last lines. "If one day you can look at me and see more than the mistake, I'll consider that my inheritance. Until then, I'll keep earning it. You once said family isn't blood, it's respect and love. I think I finally know what you meant. Your son, Matthew. The next morning, he found Philip in the workshop behind the office, the place where he repaired furniture donated to elderly clients. Sunlight cut through the dusty air, laying bars of gold across unfinished tables. Morning, Philip said, without looking up from the wood he was sanding. Morning, Matthew answered. He hesitated, then placed the envelope on the workbench. This isn't for today, just when you feel like reading it. Philip didn't ask what it was. He just nodded once, the same quiet nod that used to mean I trust you, even if you don't yet deserve it. Matthew left the workshop and stood outside for a while, the spring wind carrying the faint scent of varnish and hope. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was waiting to be forgiven. He was just living right, and that was enough. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Philip sat alone in the workshop. He turned the envelope in his hands for a long time before opening it. The letter was written in his son's uneven, careful handwriting, the kind of script that looks like it's trying to stay steady through confession. He read every word slowly, twice. Then he folded the paper, slipped it into his pocket, and sat back. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just breathed. Deep, quiet, whole. Then he picked up a small piece of cedar wood from the table, carved it into the shape of a key, and wrote one word on it with his knife. Earned. He left it by the letter for Matthew to find the next morning. No note. No speech. Just that word. Because forgiveness, when it's real, doesn't announce itself. It builds quietly. Until one day you realize it's already standing between you strong enough to hold both your names again. Redemption isn't loud. It breathes quietly through the good you do next. A year after the trial, the Franklin Foundation no longer fit inside its old brick office. It had grown beyond its walls, into churches, libraries, and community halls across the country. What began as a handful of volunteers and a stack of case files had turned into a national network for the elderly, the defrauded, and the forgotten. On the front door of every new branch hung the same brass plaque engraved with Philip's words. Integrity is the only inheritance worth leaving. Philip stood outside one of those new offices now, this one in Georgia, watching a line of people waiting patiently beneath the morning sun. Men and women in their 60s and 70s, clutching folders of paperwork, bank statements, sometimes just faith. Each one carried a story that started in loss. Each one was here to find the truth again. Matthew stood beside him, clipboard in hand, greeting people with a steadiness that came from repetition and redemption. Evelyn moved through the crowd like a conductor, her voice calm, her guidance exact. You know, she said, stopping beside them, I think we've officially outgrown the name. This isn't just Franklin anymore. It's something larger. Philip smiled. Names don't matter. The work does. Matthew looked at him, eyes soft. Still, maybe it's time we choose one together. Philip glanced at the crowd. We already did. Every person in that line is part of it. He turned to see an elderly man shaking Matthew's hand, thanking him, calling him Mr. Carter with quiet reverence. Watching it, Philip felt something shift inside him. Not pride, exactly. More like peace finding a permanent address. That afternoon they held a small gathering in the community center behind the foundation. There were no reporters, no podiums, just coffee, folding chairs, and faces full of stories. A woman named Mrs. Dalton stood and spoke first. She'd lost her home 2 years ago to a predatory lender. I thought my name didn't matter anymore, she said, her voice trembling. But you people, you brought it back. You made it belong to me again. Applause filled the room. Quiet, real. Philip smiled but said nothing. He didn't need to. The moment spoke for him. After the meeting, as the crowd thinned, a boy of about 10 ran up, Mrs. Dalton's grandson, holding a small wooden keychain. My grandma says you're the man who helps people keep their homes, he said shyly. Philip knelt. Your grandma's the one who fought for it. I just handed her the tools. The boy pressed the keychain into Philip's palm. It was carved crudely, uneven edges, the letter P burned into the wood. She said to give you this. She made it herself. Philip turned it over, the shape imperfect but honest. Tell her it's perfect, he said, voice low. When the boy ran off, Matthew stepped closer. That's the same thing you told me when I built that birdhouse, he said softly. Philip chuckled. Guess I'm running out of new lines. No, Matthew said. You're just finally living the right ones. They stood there in the fading afternoon light, surrounded by laughter and the smell of fresh coffee, and for the first time in years, nothing between them needed translation. The road to redemption is long, but every honest mile counts. By summer, the Foundation's work had become a journey, literally. Philip and Matthew packed their car and drove across the southern states, visiting towns that had written to them over the past year. Small places with single stoplights, creaky porches, and stories that echoed their own. Each stop felt like a piece of history being gently repaired. In Louisiana, they met a retired dock worker named Raymond who'd lost his pension to a forged signature. He shook Philip's hand and said, "When the lawyer told me my son had done it, I wanted to stop living, but then I saw your story on TV. You made me realize a father can forgive without forgetting." Philip smiled quietly. "Forgiveness doesn't erase what they did. It erases what it did to you." Raymond nodded, tears shining. "Then I guess I'm free." In Mississippi, they met a woman named Lena, whose niece had emptied her account after convincing her to sign insurance forms. When the case was finally reversed, Lena sent a portion of her settlement to the Franklin Foundation. "Because you showed me what justice sounds like when it doesn't need shouting," she told them. Matthew looked at her with genuine humility. "I'm still learning that," he said softly. "You already are," Lena said. You showed up. They stayed for dinner that night. Cornbread, collard greens, the kind of meal that fills silence with warmth. When they left, Lena hugged them both, whispering, "Your story made people believe again." Philip didn't answer. He couldn't. Sometimes gratitude was too heavy for words. Their last stop was in Franklin County, Alabama, the place where one of the Foundation's earliest cases began. There, a reform program at the Green Ridge Correctional Facility had started a partnership with the Foundation to teach financial literacy to soon-to-be-released inmates. The warden, a tall man with a patient smile, greeted them at the entrance. "You two started a ripple we didn't see coming," he said. "Half the guys in here used to think rebuilding was a word for carpenters. Now they use it for themselves." He handed Philip a small box. Inside was a handcrafted medallion, a circle of reclaimed wood, polished smooth, engraved with the words, "Truth redeems." "It's from the men in our rehabilitation unit," the warden said. "They said you gave them something most of them thought they'd lost forever, the chance to be better than their last mistake." Philip turned the medallion over in his hands, the grain of the wood catching the sunlight. It wasn't fancy. It was real, the kind of thing that survives because it's built honestly. He looked at Matthew. Their eyes met, and no words were needed. Matthew said quietly, "I used to think redemption meant clearing your name. Now I think it means earning your place." Philip smiled. "And you have." When they left the facility, the sun was setting behind the wire fences. From inside, they heard someone call out, "Thank you, Mr. Carter." Philip paused, listening. "For once," he said, "I think they mean both of us." They drove off as the last light spilled across the highway, painting the sky in gold and gray, the same two colors that had defined their lives. The road ahead felt endless, but for the first time, it didn't feel like running. It felt like returning to everything that mattered and everyone who still believed that goodness could grow again. Blood builds lineage. Respect builds family. The autumn light slanted through the stained glass windows of St. Augustine's Church, casting shards of color across the worn pews. Philip hadn't set foot here in years, not since the funeral of his wife, not since the silence between him and his son had grown too thick to pray through. Now, the church doors stood open. The same wooden floors creaked under his boots, the same air smelled faintly of dust and hymnals. But something was different. Peace had moved back in. A community event was being held that morning, the Foundation's annual gathering of gratitude. Evelyn stood at the front, organizing folders. Volunteers bustled about setting up chairs, coffee, and banners that read, "Rebuilding Trust, Restoring Dignity." Matthew caught sight of him and smiled. Not the hesitant smile of a son still earning forgiveness, but the open, unguarded one of a man who had finally forgiven himself. "Ready, Dad?" he asked. Philip nodded. "As I'll ever be." When it was his turn to speak, Philip didn't take the stage. He stood beside the altar instead, the way he always used to when fixing the church furniture years ago. He rested a hand on the edge of the pulpit, as though steadying both himself and the truth he was about to share. I used to come here, he began softly, and pray for success, for business, for legacy, for my son to be strong. I thought strength meant never breaking. But I learned strength is what happens after you break, when you choose to rebuild without bitterness. The room fell silent. You could hear the hum of the lights, the rustle of a single page being turned. I lost everything once. My home, my name, even the trust of the people I loved most. But I stand here today because loss isn't the opposite of life. It's how we learn what truly matters. He glanced toward Matthew, who sat in the front row, eyes glistening but steady. I forgave my son not because he deserved it, Philip said, voice trembling just slightly, but because I refused to let pain decide the rest of my story. Forgiveness doesn't change the past. It changes the future. He looked out at the faces before him, young and old, broken and mending, and let the next words come slow. Family isn't about bloodlines. It's about boundaries and respect. It's about love that doesn't demand perfection, only presence. I learned that too late for some things, but not for this moment. He reached into his pocket and took out two objects, the wooden medallion from Greenridge and the small carved key he'd made after reading Matthew's letter. He held them up. These were built by different hands in different places, but for the same reason, to remind us that truth redeems every single time. He set both on the pulpit side by side, the symbols of everything they'd lost and everything they'd rebuilt. Afterward, people lined up to thank him, but Philip barely heard the words. He stood outside the church, watching as Matthew helped pack the tables and Evelyn directed volunteers. The afternoon light spilled warm across the steps. He thought about the years behind them, the betrayal, the trial, the redemption. It had all led here, to a quiet street, a church filled with second chances, and a son who now stood taller because he'd learned to kneel first. He whispered, almost to himself, "Family isn't blood, it's respect and love." Matthew heard him, turned, and smiled. "That's your quote again?" Philip grinned. "No, that's our truth." They walked down the steps together side by side, the bell above them ringing once, low, steady, and full. And just like that, the story that began with a signature meant to erase a name ended with a legacy that could never be erased again.